Mark, a theist from New York City. Thank you so much for calling in. Hopefully, how can we help you in 2023?
What's up, gents? Happy New Year.
Oh, it's Baked Alaska. Hey, Mark.
Hey, man. It's Baked Alaska, so I figured I'd call in on New Year's Day, cheer you guys up.
Thank you.
So you're saying that, according to this thing here, it says, how being a skeptic led me to God and the evidence for it. That, you might wind up being my favorite call of all time, and it's wonderful that we're starting off the new year with someone who says that they were a skeptic, or they are a skeptic, or were, I don't know if are or were, understand it, and you have evidence that led to God. So please, enlighten me.
I like Mark. He tries to be honest even when he misses some points, but I like Mark. Go on, Mark.
Yeah, so I still am a skeptic, and the reason I mentioned that is because when I was in college, I wrote one of my actually it was like sort of my senior thesis, using relying sort of on one of Michael Shermer's books. It was written a while ago. It was called Why People Believe Weird Things. And he goes through sort of, I don't think he actually addresses the God issue in that book, but he goes through sort of some of the more popular things in culture that people believe in, like UFOs, sort of like unexplained phenomenon. And
yes, I'm familiar with the book. I have a copy. I don't know if Michael signed it for me, but I'm also friendly with Michael. What's the evidence for God?
Yeah.
What changed your mind?
Yeah. So, and just to close the loop on this real quick, one of the things in there was Holocaust. People who deny the Holocaust, and he went through sort of like what they do when they deny the Holocaust is that they look. There's obviously like a whole series of evidence. The Holocaust was an event, right? And so there's obviously a whole series of evidence that supports the conclusion that the Holocaust took place. And what the Holocaust deniers do is pick apart each element of the evidence and kind of almost like how a defense attorney would do it, and isolate that piece of evidence and fail to look at the bigger picture. And it's only when you kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture that you conclude that all of these different pieces of evidence are drawing sort of a bigger picture. And that's ultimately, because I was in college, I was agnostic, and ultimately it was through that framework that I ultimately that I got to the point where I think God exists. And I say that because as we go into discussing the pieces of evidence, none of the arguments are anywhere near conclusive. A lot of the arguments are deductive arguments or inductive arguments. They rely on God being the best explanation. And so we could discuss some of the arguments, and you'll be able to, I think, poke pretty good holes in each one. But
here's the problem. Here's the problem, Mark. When it comes to Holocaust denier, there are actual facts and data. If Holocaust deniers try to isolate one and pick it apart, they still won't be able to do that. They still won't be able to show that piece of data is incorrect. It is the reasonable, confirmable bits of data that together construct a robust picture. But merely that you can find a few things that seem to point to one particular conclusion, that's not a path. You've taken a path and said, oh, maybe myself and these other atheists are engaging in the same thing that Holocaust deniers are, because we're only looking at one piece of evidence at a time. But if every single piece of evidence is fallacious, they don't multiply and add up to a truth. You've made the mistake of thinking that because this pathway that leads people to deny one truth is similar to the method that allows people to deny another claim, that therefore it might be reasonable to deny a truth. What I want to know is, what is the reason that a skeptic should believe that a God exists? That's it. That's all I want to know. And this one of those things is like, if I said, what is the reason that a skeptic should believe that roughly 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust? You can point to each of the individual data, and why they may not, each data may not actually be robust or complete in and of itself. This is how you construct a case. This is how you construct a case in a court. This is how you build up a scientific model for something. So don't just come in here right off the bat, which is what you've done, and suggest, Let me build a framework because I don't want you guys. You can pick apart any individual evidence I have. If I can pick apart every piece of evidence you have, you don't have any fucking evidence. So what is the evidence that points to God?
Well, okay. Fair enough. And I would just say, and I'll give you an argument, but I would just say I agree. No analogy is perfect. And so the example I was giving with the Holocaust denialism, it's not a perfect analogy to this particular issue that we're discussing, but I just wanted to add, that was just sort of the starting ground that I wanted to put.
I'm going to fall asleep.
On, which is like, all right. So one of the arguments that I think is pretty persuasive is the argument from fine tuning, that when you look at cosmology and everything they've uncovered about the initial conditions of the universe, all the different parameters that are necessary for life to exist, it is so unbelievably unlikely that those parameters are all inner working.
How do you know
in
that?
The exact way that they are.
How do you know it's unlikely? How do you know it's unlikely?
How many universes can you compare this one to? So we have one universe, and we know that the information about that one. How do you know? And what other universe do you have to compare it to determine how unlikely this one is?
There are no. I mean, we're not
correct. There are none. So you have exactly one, and you're looking at it and saying that's really unlikely. You can't reach that conclusion. But let's imagine for a moment that you could reach that conclusion, and you could reasonably say, "Wow, it's highly unlikely that the particular facts about this universe could have come to be." Even with it being unlikely, what's the evidence that it was therefore the result of an intentional act by a thinking being that is powerful enough to do such a thing? We have no evidence that such a being exists. We don't even get to consider it a candidate explanation. So you have a fact, it's really unlikely, which you can't prove and can't possibly know because you have one universe. And then you have a hypothesis to explain that fact, which appeals to an explanation that you can't even demonstrate should be considered a candidate.
Well, no, to the second point, when you look at something like the universe, it's either contingent, right? It doesn't have to be this way.
I'm confused, right? Mark. Are we talking about the fine-tuning argument, or are we talking about the contingency arguments?
We're talking about fine-tuning, but within the fine-tuning,
then why did you bring up contingency?
Because you brought up the fact that what would lead you to believe, because you kind of said, granted, kind of gave me the point. You're like, look, we don't really know because this is the only universe we have. But you kind of granted me that point, and then you're like, well, how does that lead you to think that God was the cause?
What I asked was, what evidence do you have that God is a candidate explanation? What are God's properties? God's
properties are, I mean, you have the traditional, like he's omnipotent, he's omnipresent, he's all good, all knowing. Those are the traditional, and then you have some of the other properties that come up when you look at, like for example, in the Kalam argument, and I think maybe even in the fine-tuning argument, where you have kind of this idea of God being timeless and spaceless and unchanging, sort of the prime mover. I think ultimately is the conceptual model. And
okay, so far on God's properties, you listed omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, timeless, spaceless, unchanging, prime mover. Pick one of those and prove that that's a property of God.
I'm sorry?
Pick one of those and prove that it's a property of God.
Well, you can't. You could make an inference to the best explanation.
I'm not interested in you. We're trying to figure out whether or not the God you're advocating for which you have now listed 7 properties or 8.
Right.
I'm trying to figure out why you would consider that God to be a candidate explanation, because how did you prove that there is such a being that has those properties?
So by inference. So for example, like the reason I said he was the first mover is because otherwise you have an infinite series of contingent events. You don't get to do that. You say, because even if absent this being, there's an infinite regress, you would then have to demonstrate why there couldn't be an infinite regress, and that this is actually the case, that
in the absence of God, there's an infinite regress. You just asserted that it's the case that without God, we have an infinite regress, but that's not necessarily true. But even if it were true, even what you're suggesting is that here's a set of affairs that require an explanation, and I'm going to say that God has the exact properties to satisfy that. But that doesn't prove that that being exists. It doesn't prove that there is such a being that could satisfy that.
No, I agree, and I think a lot of these questions are sort of.
If you agreed, then you wouldn't be sitting here saying that you're a skeptic with evidence for God. What is the evidence for God?
No, what I'm saying is that these issues, like for example, with the infinite series, right? If you have an infinite series of contingent events,
you can't. There's no such thing. Infinity isn't a quantity; it's a concept. There, you can't. As soon as you say infinite series, you are quantifying infinity, which is not possible. I want to know what evidence there is for God.
Okay, there is the argument. I'm putting forward the argument, the fine tuning.
I'm not interested in some version of the various arguments that I've dealt with for 20 fucking years. I want to know what piece of evidence you can point to that points to a God. Evidence for a proposition isn't merely some fact that is consistent with a proposition. It is a piece of information that is discreetly identifies this is the proposition that is most likely given the available information. But you can't say this is the proposition that is most likely as an explanation if you can't show that thing even exists.
No, but this is why at the beginning I tried to preface that what basically the theist.
Yes, at the beginning you tried to poison the well.
No, what I'm trying to say is that like you have to and look, forget the Holocaust.
You absolutely no. Hang on, Mark. I swear, Mark, I'm going to let you finish. But you absolutely did start by poisoning the well because you started by talking about how in Shermer's book he describes the sort of steps people go through in order to deny the truth of the Holocaust. That is called poisoning the well. You are setting up an expectation. You are setting up a straw version of all this so that you can say those of us who don't agree with your conclusion that there's a God are doing the same thing that the Holocaust deniers are doing. And the thing is, I'm not a Holocaust denier. I haven't denied anything for which there is factual evidence. And it's dishonest to suggest that that's what we're doing with a God when every time I ask you a question as to how you can determine that God is even a candidate explanation for anything, you give me nothing. When you list the properties of God, you list the classical theism, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, timeless, spaceless, unchanging prime mover. But when I ask you to show how you know any of those are true, you have nothing. How do you know that there is a being who has these properties?
Well, some of it, but it's sort of by the nature of the case, right? Like when you get down to, in science and philosophy, to some of the fundamentals, you can't define things beyond, like, it's very hard to define things. Like if you were to say, what is matter? What is energy? Like it's very, you reach a certain point in ontology where you just can't go beyond certain descriptions. And so, like, for example, the idea
Mark, that's
of
a complete dodge. I asked how you knew that these were true, and now you're saying, well, it's really difficult. You can't really isolate these things. And yet, when I asked you for properties of God, you rattled them off. So are you saying that you don't know that there's a God or a being that has those properties?
No. So, for example, in the Kalam, when you get to the point in the argument where you're trying to identify Mark, what could be the cause.
Do you understand how frustrating it is to repeatedly ask someone a question and then have them dodge it and then ignore the fact that you made a point only to go into another point? You started with fine tuning, then you tried to go to contingency, and now while discussing how you can demonstrate that God has the properties you say he has, now you decide to go to the Kalam. Well, let me tell you, the Kalam cosmological argument in its standard form is everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for existence. The Kalam cosmological argument includes nothing at all about a God or the cause or the nature of the cause or any of the features of the nature of the cause. So why, after I ask you for specifics, do you decide to jump to an argument that has zero specifics and no evidence for the existence of a God?
Just because I was trying to get to the point where, like you said, you get to the point where you have a cause, and then you have to take the next step and say, let's look, what could that cause be? What could the cause of space and time be? And that's why I said earlier, it's just something that
I don't know that there is a cause. I don't know that there is a cause, and I don't know what the cause could be. You're the one who's claiming that you do know what the cause could be, so make the case.
Okay, so since the concept is the cause of space, of time, it cannot be something that exists within time or within space,
How do you know that?
or else because then those things would already have existed.
No, they could have come into existence at the exact. They could have come into existence at the exact same time. Go listen to Bill Craig. That's a possibility?
Okay, and look, Matt, what I'm trying to say is I don't want
okay. No. Stop, Mark. Mark, I'm bored now because now I've made point after point after point and given you opportunity to actually make a fucking statement that says, here's what God is, here's how I know what God is, and here's the evidence that I have. This evidence should satisfy anybody who identifies as a skeptic. Instead, you've demonstrated that you don't really have an understanding of how skepticism should work on issues like this, because when I push you for specifics, you just talk about how it's hard. You also demonstrate that you didn't understand that the Kalam doesn't lead to that, and that that time doesn't even necessarily work in the way that you'd like it to work, to say that this thing must be timeless. But whatever it is, even if we were to assume, I keep giving you the benefit of doubt on all these. If we were to assume that there must be a cause of the universe and that it is timeless and spaceless, okay? That doesn't tell you whether or not it has to be intelligent, whether or not it has to have intent, whether or not it has agency at all. It doesn't tell you whether it's all powerful or just powerful enough. It doesn't tell you whether it's omnipresent or just present enough, or just present where it needs to be. It doesn't tell you anything at all about whether or not it's benevolent. But the fact that you brought up omnibenevolence should disqualify you entirely from any conversation on this, because whether or not the God is good is irrelevant to whether or not a God might exist that had kind of done all this. You have no clue what you're talking about, and when I ask you to prove it, you keep dodging. How is it that you can identify as a skeptic, which is someone who should say, I'm not going to believe something until there is strong evidentiary warrant for that belief, because I'd rather not believe things that aren't true, and then present this absolutely sloppy, non-specific case for God?
Well, look, it might be sloppy because I'm not a trained apologist, okay? I'm just a normal person, okay? This is not something I do professionally. So
I'm aware of that.
What I'm trying to make is, okay.
What I'm saying is, you've reached a conclusion. You've reached a conclusion, and you called in to defend it, yet you don't defend it. Give me a piece of evidence. No, you don't.
I think, Matt, you, I know, have a lot of expertise in this field. You're aware there are theistic arguments for every single one of those things you mentioned. No, sir. I'm not aware that there are sound theistic arguments. I'm aware that people, you can present, you can present an argument for anything. Why would you say that I'm aware that there are theistic arguments? Well, obviously I am. The issue is not whether or not there are arguments. Their issue is whether or not there are valid and sound arguments. Correct? Agreed.
Now, are you suggesting that I am aware of sound arguments for theism?
No. Well, no. I think subjectively,
because that would be fucking absurd. So why did you bring up the fact that I know? Because if what I know is that there are unsound or non-sound arguments for a God, why would you bring up that I know that? That's like saying, Matt, you know that there's arguments that the election was stolen in 2020.
The reason I did that is because
I didn't get to finish.
Presented it as. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Would you have ever said to me, Matt, you're aware there are arguments that the 2020 election was stolen?
Would I say something like that to you? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
No.
Okay. Why not? Are you aware? Are you aware, Mark? Are you aware that there are arguments that the 2020 election was stolen?
Yes, I'm aware there are arguments, yes.
So then why don't you believe the 2020 election was stolen?
The reason I said that is because
Why won't you answer my question?
Because I don't think
believe,
the arguments are convincing.
Do you believe the 2020 election was stolen?
No.
But you're aware there are arguments that it was stolen, right?
Yes.
That question for me did absolutely nothing to address what you believe or why, correct?
It did not, no.
And then that's exactly what you did to me, so why?
Well, the difference is because we weren't having a conversation about the election where I had posited something where
Mark,
making you sound like you're off the reservation.
We're done. I just used a perfect hand walked you ass through a perfect analogy of how what you just said to me was a complete non sequitur, was a complete irrelevancy, and your response to why you did that, shut up. Your response to why you did that is because we weren't talking about the election. Are you going to pretend to be so obtuse that you can't understand the analogy here?
Maybe I didn't understand it, but can I try to get
Let me try it one more time. Let's imagine for a second. You and I are having a conversation about God, and me and Jimmy, and you and Jimmy are having a conversation about the 2020 election. And you believe that there's a God, and you believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And Jimmy is asking you questions to prove that the 2020 election was stolen, and I'm asking you questions to prove that there is a God. Would you, in response to Jimmy, say, well, Jimmy, you're aware there are arguments that the 2020 election was stolen. You don't have to answer. You've already said you would not say that. And when I asked why you wouldn't say that, why was it that you wouldn't say it? Because it's not relevant? Because it doesn't add anything? And yet I asked you why you asked me, why you suggested that I'm aware that there's arguments for God. Is it because you're implying that those arguments are in fact sound, but the 2020 election arguments aren't? Yes? Yes. But that's what you think about those arguments, not what I think about those arguments. And you're aware that I don't think those arguments are sound, so why bring it up?
Because what I'm trying to understand, and I don't understand this, is how unsound do you think they are? Because what I've
unsound is unsound is unsound is unsound. There's not degrees of unsound. Something is either sound or it's not.
Actually, something can be completely fallacious and logically false.
No, sir.
You could have
an argument. An argument is either sound or it is not sound. Period. End of sentence.
Okay, maybe sound is not the right word then. The point I'm trying to make is that, and some of this is subjective, right? Like the theist presents these different arguments, and some of them there's premises within the argument that are they're either more probable, the person putting forward the argument is saying,
no, sir.
Is more
if we're talking about probable, no, that's modal logic. I thought we were talking about deductive arguments. There's not probabilities involved here. They're all discrete. It's all X is true, not X is probably true.
Well, it could be a modal argument. I'm talking about the premise within these arguments. Right?
I am too.
Like, for example, okay. All right. So for example, with the Kalam, when it says that the universe began to exist, there's scientific evidence that suggests that. We don't know for certain. But the premise is built sort of on the notion that it's likely.
I'm sorry, Mark, but first of all, there are two premises to the Kalam. Neither of them are necessarily true, and nothing about the Kalam points to any conclusion other than the universe had a cause. It doesn't tell you anything about the properties of it. Why do you keep going back to the Kalam when the Kalam has nothing to do with God?
I'm also disappointed because Mark just made a point that I explained to you thoroughly on Tuesday, and then you agreed with it. And now you've made the same bad point again that I've already refuted and explained to you, that the colloquial use, the way we say the universe had a beginning to refer to the Big Bang, does not necessarily mean the actual scientific existential beginning of the universe was the Big Bang. It might be, it might not be. I'm disappointed you used the same argument you already agreed was wrong before.
I'm only using it for illustrative purposes to basically just to use an example.
I'm almost completely done with you, Mark. I'm tired of illustrations and everything else. Do you have fucking evidence that a God exists or not?
Yes, I think there's evidence that we have.
Present I didn't ask what you think. Start with one piece of evidence for God.
Okay, that we are conscious and that science cannot explain consciousness. And therefore...
I'm done, Mark. And I'm going to explain why, just so that you don't think it's incredibly rude. The fact that we are conscious is not evidence for a God. The fact that we are conscious is evidence that we are conscious. To find an explanation for why we're conscious, we begin a search. And we begin by listing candidate explanations that could be the reason or the justification or the explanation for our consciousness.
Right.
Among those candidate explanations is not God is the answer for consciousness. God doesn't even get to become a candidate explanation until you demonstrate that it exists and is in fact a candidate explanation. So you don't get to say that evidence for God is that we're conscious, just like you don't get to say evidence that the butler killed someone is that there's a body, because the body is not tied in any way discreetly to the butler until you draw that chain. The body is evidence that there's a body.
If you're going to set the epistemic bar so high, it will never...
No, sir. I've set the epistemic bar just high enough so that I'm not a gullible buffoon. And if you're going to sit here after I patiently walk you through and explain the difference between evidence for proposition and claim, therefore points to God, and just suggest that I've set my evidentiary bar too high, you don't understand skepticism, you don't understand logic, you don't have evidence, and you are done wasting my time. Have a wonderful new year.
All right, later, guys.
Well, wait, before Mark, before you go, did you
I already hung up.
I was just going to ask him. I was going to ask him if he remembers the call on Tuesday. I began by saying, I'm going to keep telling you how to debate me better. And I looked at the notes and I said to him, here is tip number 1. Don't do, and I was going to ask him if he remembers what I said. Because the tip number 1 was don't do some dressed up version of God of the Gaps. And then we talked about that and I explained to him and he was like, okay, I'm not going to do that. And then when he finally said he's going to present his evidence to you, he literally started with, well, science can't explain consciousness. Hello, everyone. I'm Jimmy Snow. I'm the executive producer of The Line. And at night, I sneak into Matt Dillahunty's house and I trade his cereals for other cereals. He comes out and he's like, wait, these are cereals I buy, but I swear I had different cereals. Anyway, would you like to support this channel or any specific show? You can do so over on Patreon or in channel memberships. There are special tiers for special shows or for the channel at large, and it helps us expand programming as well as hopefully very soon launch it in podcast form. Now, also, if you'd like to support, you can like, you can subscribe, you can leave a comment or a super thanks, which is a special highlighted comment that you pay for. Those are fun. And, screw the algorithm, go check out something over here, I suppose. Boy, I hope I can still put those icons there, because if I can't, this is going to look really stupid. I'm going to go buy some Cocoa Puffs and switch out Matt's mini wheats now.